They're an act of war to some degree. Warren Buffett once remarked about tariffs. The tooth fairy doesn't pay them. Throughout history, nations have wielded tariffs not just as simple border taxes, but as economic weapons capable of reshaping entire economies and international relations. For 2 centuries, these duties have built empires, triggered depressions, and fundamentally altered the course of global trade. Today, we'll explore how these seemingly mundane taxes became instruments of economic warfare and how they've changed the world we live in. In 1789, the newly formed United States enacted its first major tariff law. With a modest 8% duty on most imports, it wasn't meant to protect industries. It was designed purely to generate revenue. This original tariff raised approximately $1.7 million in its first year, around $53 million in today's dollars, funding nearly 90% of the federal government's entire operations. By the 1820s, however, something fundamental was changing. American leaders began viewing tariffs not just as revenue tools, but as weapons to defend growing American industries against established European manufacturers. In 1824, Henry Clay championed what he called the American System, a series of high protective tariffs designed to shield American factories from foreign competition. The resulting tariff of 1828 was so extreme, reaching rates of up to 62% on certain imports, that Southerners dubbed it the Tariff of Abominations. The South Carolina legislature declared the tariff unconstitutional, threatening secession over this economic policy. President Andrew Jackson responded by threatening military action, stating, "Disunion by armed force is treason." The crisis was only resolved when Congress passed a compromise bill, gradually reducing the tariffs. This early battle established a critical precedent. Tariffs weren't merely taxes, they were economic weapons capable of driving nations to the brink of war. Few American leaders underwent a more dramatic transformation on tariffs than Abraham Lincoln. As a young congressman in 1847, Lincoln opposed protective tariffs, writing that he could not perceive any good reason for imposing a higher duty. Yet by his presidency, Lincoln had become one of America's staunchest protectionists, pushing through the Morrill Tariff of 1861 that raised duties to an average of 47%, more than doubling previous levels. What changed? The Civil War created an unprecedented need for revenue. These tariffs generated over $55 million annually during the conflict, equivalent to nearly $1.7 billion today. Without this massive tariff revenue, the Union might have struggled to finance its war effort. But Lincoln's conversion wasn't purely pragmatic. He had come to believe protective tariffs were essential for American industrial development, declaring, "Give us a protective tariff, and we will have the greatest nation on earth." Lincoln's transformation reflected a broader American shift, from an agricultural economy hostile to tariffs to an industrial powerhouse that saw them as essential to national prosperity. By the 1890s, tariffs had evolved into powerful political symbols. Republican William McKinley built his entire political career as the Napoleon of protection, championing the McKinley Tariff of 1890, which raised duties to nearly 50% on average. These duties generated enormous sums, over $355 million annually by 1900, representing over $12 billion in today's dollars, and funding more than 40% of federal spending. America was becoming an industrial juggernaut behind these tariff walls. But the global response was fierce. Germany's Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, implemented retaliatory tariffs on American agricultural goods, declaring, "If the Americans close their market against our grain, we must close our market against their manufacturers." A global tariff war was brewing, with nations using these economic weapons to punish rivals and protect domestic industries. Between 1880 and 1914, average tariff rates worldwide doubled, creating economic barriers that contributed to the growing international tensions preceding World War I. The most catastrophic use of tariffs as economic weapons came in 1930 with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Signed by President Herbert Hoover despite warnings from 1,028 economists who petitioned against it, the act raised duties to unprecedented levels, some exceeding 100%. Within 2 years, American imports had plunged from $4.4 billion to $1.3 billion, a 70% collapse. But more devastatingly, other nations immediately retaliated. Canada raised tariffs on 16 American products by 50%. Spain adopted the wise tariff against American goods. Britain abandoned its historic free trade policy to implement protective duties. Global trade spiraled downward as nations engaged in economic warfare through increasingly punitive tariffs. World trade plummeted by 66% between 1929 and 1934, transforming what might have been a severe recession into the Great Depression. The economic devastation was staggering. Smoot-Hawley and the retaliatory tariffs it provoked didn't just damage economies, they helped destabilize global politics, contributing to the rise of extremist governments and setting the stage for World War II. The catastrophic consequences of Smoot-Hawley taught world leaders a harsh lesson. After World War II, nations began a remarkable experiment in tariff reduction through the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT. Between 1947 and 1994, average global tariff rates fell from over 40% to under 5%. The results were extraordinary. Global trade expanded from $58 billion in 1948 to over $5 trillion by 1994, generating unprecedented prosperity and helping forge what we now call globalization. U.S. tariff revenue, which had once funded nearly the entire federal government, dwindled to insignificance, totaling just $36 billion in 2018, less than 1% of federal revenue. The world had seemingly moved away from tariffs as economic weapons, or so it appeared. One of history's most remarkable conversions on tariff policy came from Japan's longest-serving Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe. When he first came to power in 2006, Abe was a traditional Japanese conservative who had long supported protective measures for Japan's farmers and manufacturers. In his early career, Abe had declared, "We must protect Japanese agriculture as a matter of national security." He initially opposed major free trade deals, arguing they would undermine Japan's traditional industries. Yet by his second term beginning in 2012, Abe had undergone a profound transformation. Facing China's rising economic dominance and America's pivot toward protectionism, Abe surprised the world by becoming Asia's most vocal champion of free trade. When President Trump withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership in 2017, Abe didn't abandon the agreement, he took leadership of it, pushing through a revised TPP-11 that eliminated some 18,000 tariffs among member nations. In a direct rebuke to growing protectionism, Abe declared at Davos, "Japan has been walking the talk of free trade." He successfully concluded the world's largest free trade agreement between Japan and the European Union, eliminating tariffs on 99% of traded goods. Abe's conversion from protectionist to free trade champion represented a strategic calculation that Japan's future depended not on tariff walls, but on open markets and rules-based trade. His transformation shows how leaders can dramatically reverse positions on tariffs when strategic realities change. In 2018, the world witnessed the most dramatic return to tariffs as economic weapons since the 1930s. President Donald Trump declaring that trade wars are good and easy to win, imposed duties on washing machines, solar panels, steel, aluminum, and eventually over $360 billion worth of Chinese goods. For the first time in generations, tariffs became major revenue generators, bringing in more than $85 billion in 2019 alone, while imposing costs on American consumers estimated at $57 billion annually. The tariffs were explicitly wielded as weapons for purposes beyond trade balances. Trump deployed them to force Mexico to change immigration policies, to pressure Canada on dairy regulations, and to punish the European Union over aircraft subsidies. "Tariffs are the greatest," Trump declared. "Either a country negotiates a fair deal, or it gets hit with tariffs." The world response was swift and targeted. China retaliated with duties on $110 billion of American exports. The EU imposed tariffs on $3.2 billion worth of iconic American products like bourbon, motorcycles, and blue jeans. Mexico prepared duties specifically targeting congressional districts held by Republican representatives. While Trump embraced tariffs as weapons, Russian President Vladimir Putin underwent a remarkable reversal in the opposite direction. Early in his presidency, Putin was a strong proponent of protective tariffs. In 2008, he imposed a 30% duty on foreign car imports to protect Russian automakers, declaring, "We must create conditions where it is more profitable to produce in Russia than to import." Between 2008 and 2012, Russia maintained some of the highest tariff barriers among major economies, with duties averaging nearly 11% across all imports. Yet as sanctions following the 2014 Crimea annexation began isolating Russia's economy, Putin dramatically reversed course. By 2018, he had slashed Russia's average tariff rate to just 4.7%, one of the largest tariff reductions of any major economy in that period. In a surprising statement at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, Putin declared, "Protectionism leads nowhere. The system of multilateral cooperation, which was built over decades, is no longer allowed to evolve. It is being broken in a very crude way." Putin's conversion wasn't based on free trade principles, but survival. Facing Western sanctions, Russia needed new markets and sought to position itself as a champion of open trade with non-Western partners. Yet by 2022, following the Ukraine invasion and faced with unprecedented sanctions, Putin would revert to protectionism once again, implementing some of the highest tariff barriers in Russian history. For 200 years, tariffs have served as economic weapons, reshaping nations and triggering both prosperity and devastation. From Lincoln's conversion to Abe's strategic reversal, from the catastrophe of Smoot-Hawley to Trump's tariff revolution, these duties have never been mere taxes, they've been instruments of national power. Warren Buffett was right. Tariffs are indeed acts of war to some degree. They may not draw blood directly, but throughout history, they've redirected the flow of wealth, reshaped global power, and sometimes pushed nations toward actual conflict. As we face a world where tariffs are once again being wielded as weapons, the lessons of the past 2 centuries serve as both warning and guide. These economic armaments can protect industries and generate revenue, but they can also trigger retaliation, damage consumers, and destabilize the global order. The question facing us now is whether we've truly learned from tariff battles of the past, or if we're condemned to repeat them.